I would like, of course, to wish every one of us a Shana Tova U'Metuka, a good and a sweet new year. But more than that, I'd like to wish to everyone a Shana Tova Yoter, a good year, but a better one than this one. I am now 72 years old. That's not fun. But I don't remember a year in my lifetime that was quite as difficult for the Jewish people as this past year was. On October 7th, Hamas wounded 3,300 people, took 251 hostages, killed more than 1,200 innocent Jews and others during a day of brutal savagery, unspeakable and undeniable sexual violence. 101 hostages remain in Gaza today. We don't know how many of them are alive. That includes 101, out of that includes 7 Americans, 4 probably alive. Keith Siegel, whose family lives in Raleigh, is included in that number. Listen to this, over 26,000 rockets have been fired at Israel, 3,000 just in the past week. These included 13,200 from Gaza, 5,000 plus on October 7th alone, more than 12,400, and that number is more now, from Lebanon, 60 from Syria, 180 from Yemen, 400 plus from Iran, the latter of which occurred in 2 direct attacks on Israel on April 13th and on October 1st. Some 17,000 Hamas terrorists and members of other terror groups have been killed. Since October 7th, 2023, some 729 Israeli soldiers have lost their lives and another 4,576 have been wounded. Tens of thousands of Israelis in the south and also predominantly in the north are still unable to return to their homes. In the Gaza Strip, since the beginning of the war, troops have located and destroyed some 4,700 tunnel shafts. The tunnels are estimated to be more than 400 miles long. Indeed, the losses have been significant. The human tragedy has been great. Hamas refused to release hostages as part of a ceasefire and continues to use its own citizens as human shields. Hamas has stolen tons of food provided as humanitarian aid and sold it to Gazans at inflated prices. According to Hamas, 40,000 plus Palestinian lives have been lost. These numbers do not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Tens of thousands of Gazan homes have been destroyed, and you cannot be a human being, or I would say a Jew, without recognizing the enormity of the tragedy in Gaza. But the ultimate responsibility for that tragedy lies with Hamas. I find myself thinking, what is it that makes a free and safe Jewish country? What is it that makes Israel so important to us as Jews? So I want to tell you a true story, 3 true stories. Actually, the first one is from the period of the Nazi Holocaust. In April 1943, the most significant revolt against the Nazis took place. It was the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, and in the story of the heroism of the ghetto fighters, led by 23-year-old Mordecai Analevich. There were 6 Nazi death camps, and the word about the revolt in Warsaw spread to the death camps. In September of 1943, a revolt took place in the death camp known as Treblinka. In Treblinka, 800,000 Jews were murdered. The revolt was successful and shut down the camp. Very few Jews, less than 150, survived and escaped to tell the story. Now, less than 2 months later, on November 3rd, something happened at the camp of Majdanek, one of the other 6 camps, that is important to remember. On that day, on November 3rd, 1943, the Nazis gathered 18,000 Jews at Majdanek and slaughtered them in a pit which had been dug for the bodies. If you've been with me on the March of the Living, we have stood next to that pit. But elsewhere, on the very same day, on November 3rd, elsewhere in Poland, the Nazis gathered and slaughtered tens of thousands of other Jews on the same day. It is estimated that 41,000 Jews were murdered on November 3rd, 1943. The Nazis referred to it as the Erntenfest, the Harvest Festival. Many scholars feel that the reason for this slaughter, however, a slaughter that in large measure wiped out a significant portion of the Nazi labor workforce, but that the reason was that the Nazis were concerned that a revolt was about to break out at Treblinka. Now, I mention this partially because when we talk about what happened on October 7th, we often say that this was the greatest slaughter of Jews since the Nazi Holocaust. Well, what happened on November 3rd, 1943 was the greatest slaughter of Jews during the Holocaust in a single day. In January of 1944, 2 months later, a woman by the name of Gisela Abramson was sent to Majdanek as a slave laborer. 6 months later, in July of 1944, on the last day of the camp, the Nazis lined up the remaining prisoners and shot them in the very same pits that they had used in November of that year. Gisela was lucky. She was not hit, but fell into the pit, laid there under bodies for more than a day, and she hoped that somehow or another she would survive. Indeed, she was rescued by the Soviet army, who when they came there, someone felt that her hand, thought that they saw a hand moving. They pulled her out, they brushed her off, and then they said, go, just go. And she wandered around Europe as a young woman until after the war she ended up in a hospital in a displaced persons, a DP camp. And after months of recuperation, Gisela came to the United States in 1946 to live with an aunt in New York City. She was the only member of her family to survive. She graduated from high school in 1947, from college in 1951. In 52, she married Paul Abramson, and in 1970, they moved to Raleigh, where her husband worked for IBM. They had 2 children, 4 grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild. For over 38 years, Gisela dedicated herself to teaching about the Holocaust and about tolerance throughout the state of North Carolina. I was privileged to meet this woman once in my life. She was amazing. One of her children, Mike Abramson, is a friend of mine. Gisela was part of a small group of individuals who included, by the way, Rabbi Arnold Task and Sylvia Salmon, who were responsible for convincing Governor Jim Hunt to create the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust in 1981. Her son Mike took over the council in 1999, and thanks to his tireless efforts, on November 18, 2021, the Gisela Abramson Holocaust Education Act was passed into law when Governor Cooper signed the budget. The law mandates Holocaust education in middle and high schools in North Carolina, and I'm proud to be part of that educational program, and I'm proud of the Greensboro Jewish Federation for supporting the Holocaust Council. Now let me tell you one other story. There was a very young and pretty woman named Noah ben David, who went to the Nova Music Festival and danced throughout the night on October 6th. On October 7th, she hid in a shelter with 2 other people. All 3 of them pretended to be dead. Like Gisela, they hid under a pile of bodies, in this case, 13 murdered bodies. Including among those 13 murdered bodies was Noam ben David's boyfriend, David. Some hours later, she was stayed by the Israel Defense Forces, but they took care of her. They, unlike what happened to Gisela, they just didn't say, okay, go away. She wasn't left to fend for herself. Meanwhile, the Israeli Defense Force collected the bodies of the murdered young people from the Nova Festival and sent them to a base called Shur. A 60-year-old woman who had moved to Israel from America, named Sherry Mendez, was part of a volunteer unit within the military rabbinate. And on October 7th, later in the day, she went down to Shur, to the base, and volunteered to take care of the bodies of the women who had been slaughtered. Particularly, she volunteered to take care of the young women who had been murdered at the Nova Music Festival. And recently she was asked whether or not, after preparing these young women for burial, their parents were able to get a last look at them. And her answer was absolutely not. And then she said, and I quote, "They were shot so many times in the head that in many cases it seemed to be a purposeful obliteration of the women's faces. The bodily mutilation, some of it overtly sexual that these young women endured was so terrible that their families were not able to tell their beloved daughters a goodbye with a last look." Now these stories, my friend, not only illustrate that which occurred on October 7th, but tell us why it is so imperative that there is a Jewish state, that there is an Israel existing as a secure, self-determining political entity in the homeland of Am Yisrael and the homeland of the Jewish people. It is stories like this that represent the fulfillment of Zionism. Now I want to tell you something. Being a Zionist does not mean that I agree with every decision made by the current Israeli government. I've been at anti-government demonstrations in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I want to say that again. I want you to know that being a Zionist does not mean that I agree with every decision of the current Israeli government. But I also want to tell you that being American doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with every decision of the American government. And yet, just as I would not dare to negate the importance of the United States of America as a beacon of freedom in our world, I would never, ever negate the importance, the critical importance of the State of Israel. During the Holocaust, the Nazis used a technique known as the big lie technique. The idea was tell a lie, no matter how false it is, and keep on telling it, and eventually most people are going to believe it. The big lie technique exists today, especially among people both on the far left and on the far right. The far right believes that Jews are trying to take over the world. It's the far right people who chanted in Charlottesville in 2018, "Jews will not replace us." The far left has numerous examples of that technique, including a letter to the editor of the Greensboro News and Record less than 2 weeks ago. In that letter, the statement was made, I'm surprised that the letter was published, but the statement was made that Israel murdered some of its own citizens on October 7th rather than see them captured as hostages by Hamas. The big lie technique is used to state that Israel is guilty of genocide, especially in Gaza. Now, I don't want to downplay for 1 second the tragedy and the tragic suffering of the people in Gaza. However, the definition of genocide does not apply to Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, no matter how terrible things are in Gaza, and no matter how you feel about it. The big lie technique is used as an instrument to deny what occurred on October 7th. The denialists are out there denying that children were not incinerated in ovens in front of their parents or murdered in front of their parents. The denialists are out there saying women were not brutally raped, murdered, mutilated, and others. The denialists are out there saying that Israel did not send hundreds of trucks into Gaza every day. The denialists go on and on. But one of the most appalling aspects, friends, during the last year was the failure of international women's organizations to condemn the gender-based crimes against Jewish women. Professor Gil Troy, an eminent professor at McGill University, wrote an article on this topic. The article is entitled, Feminists are Consenting to Rape Culture. And in that article he said, on October 7th, the violated women shouted, shrieked, cried, begged, rape after rape, cut after cut, fighting off the assaults with their voices and their bare hands as best they could. Some hostages may still be struggling, and yet you, the international women's organizations, are silent around this, violating every feminist principle I've ever read and respected. Today's feminist movement is silently consenting to the mass crime against women and against the victims from 36 countries. Some even doubt the testimonials and the staggering, bloody, heartbreaking evidence of stripped Jewish women paraded through Gaza streets. But there's another aspect of what happened during the past year. This past year, as we know, has been a very difficult year for Jews in the United States. There's been more than 10,000 anti-Semitic incidents that occurred since October 7th, 2023. This is up from 3,325 during the prior year. This marks the most incidents recorded in a 12-month period since the ADL began tracking these threats in 1979. Jews have been beaten in the streets of New York, LA, and every other city. Synagogues and Jewish other institutions have been vandalized with Nazi symbolism. Windows of Jewish homes have been shattered. U.S. colleges have limited the movement of their Jewish students. Restaurants have refused to serve Jews. Jews have been harassed when leaving kosher restaurants. There have been thousands marching in the streets, holding up the flags of Hamas and other terrorist organizations which are dedicated to the annihilation of the Jewish people. U.S. courts have had to force academic institutions not to discriminate against Jews. The faculty of major U.S. colleges and universities openly admitted that anti-Semitism depends upon context. In Greensboro, the Holocaust Memorial was defaced with a Nazi swastika. In Greensboro, a middle school student was bullied by a teacher. In Greensboro, there have been terrible anti-Semitic things said to children at school. In Greensboro, religious institutions, including this one, have had fake bomb threat phone calls dialed into them with the purpose of disrupting their activities. But that's not all. That's not all, folks. Let me tell you about the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Last May, Students for Justice in Palestine poured red paint, which was meant to resemble spilled blood on the steps of the South Building, an office building for administrative staff and the chancellor. Faculty members and students are continuing their anti-Israel activism and indoctrination. A statement by the UNC Students for Justice in Palestine said the following: "It is our moral obligation to be in solidarity with the dispossessed, no matter the pathway to liberation they choose to take, and this includes violence." On October 12th, Student Justice for Palestine held a day of resistance. The event flyer celebrated the terrorism of October 7th with a Hamas paraglider en route to kill Israelis and others. And in a widely circulated video from that day, there was a protester from UNC who screamed, "All of us are Hamas." On April 30th of this year, a mob of Palestinian protesters defaced property at UNC Chapel Hill and yanked down an American flag and put up a Palestinian flag in its place. They formed a mob and marched across the campus screaming at the top of their lungs, spraying graffiti so vile that I cannot from this pulpit even mention. And then, of course, they pulled down the American flag that flies over Chapel Hill's ROTC building. Whether it's in Israel or in the United States, my friends, the Jewish community is facing some of the most serious problems it has since World War II. And there are 4 things that we need to do now to respond to this situation. So first of all, if you are in middle school, high school, college, or graduate school, I want you to stand up right now. Anyone here? Come on, stand up. Don't be bashful. I'm talking to you. You got me? All right? You can't zone out now. Here is what I want you and you and you and you and you and you to do. If you are a victim of an anti-Semitic incident or witness one, please make sure you tell your parents. If you're in college, tell the officials, particularly people at Hillel. And finally, I want you to make sure that you call Handsome over here. You need to call Rabbi Korn. All right? And you need to let him know what occurred. If you don't have the number, take this. It's in there. Now, it is critical. It is absolutely critical that if this happens to you or you observe it, you report it. And in our congregation, the address for reporting such things is Rabbi Korn. Sit down. Second, it's important that we make sure that Israel defend itself, that Israel can defend itself. The pro-Hamas protesters are calling for an arms embargo against Israel. Such an embargo could weaken Israel's ability to defend itself. In terms of history, this would be catastrophic. It would not only weaken Israel, but it would in no way serve the interests of the free world. Sadly, the calls for an arms embargo actually have made it more difficult to negotiate the release of the hostages. And sadly, the calls for an arms embargo basically embolden Iran. And worst of all, it would 80 years after the Holocaust, 80 years after the story that I just told you about Gisela Abramson, 80 years later it would make Jews vulnerable to fascist terrorism. So it's important now. It's as important now as it has ever been to be in contact with members of Congress, urging them to continue American support for the state of Israel. The telephone number for the Congressional Switchboard is up there. 202-224-3121. It's in my cell phone, but don't take out yours. Because the number is also here on page 2, underneath the Kol Nidre service, along with Rabbi Korn's number. Any member of the House or the Senate can be reached through this telephone number. Once again, friends, let it not be said, God forbid that it should be said, that we did not raise our voices at this critical time when the state of Israel is putting the lives of its soldiers, men and women, on the line to preserve Jewish dignity and statehood. Third, it's now time for us to increase our commitment to actively expressing our Jewish identity. To surge, there's no place to begin this surge than right here at Temple Emmanuel. Now, I realize I'm prejudiced, but I'm telling you, this is a great congregation with a wonderful rabbis. And as we approach the end of these days of awe, let's make a commitment to become more engaged in Jewish education, more engaged in prayer, more engaged in social activities. Let us make a commitment to become more engaged in programs that advocate against anti-Semitism, programs that build community. Let us dedicate ourselves to becoming more engaged in Jewish life. Let us work together for a strong American Jewish community and a strong, strong state of Israel. And that brings me to my fourth point. In order to do all this, it's important for us to stay together. Yes, we will have differences, but Jewish unity, more than ever, Jewish unity is of paramount importance. The most physically difficult experience in my life was when I was in basic training with the Israel Defense Forces when we did what was known as a stretcher carry. This is a picture of a stretcher carry that actually was painted by a survivor of the October 7th massacre from one of the kibbutzim on the border. The point is that in a stretcher carry, the people carrying the innocent person cannot drop that person. Each person must do his or her part. Too much is at stake. In a stretcher carry, the survival of the person who's been injured is dependent upon each one of the people carrying him or her. And at this time, that, my friends, is symbolic of where we are as Jews. The survival of our people and of Israel is now dependent upon our unity. One of my teachers and one of the greatest rabbis of the 20th century, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shlomi, once taught many times, the only way to get it together is together. My colleague, Rabbi Andrew Paley, teaches that, quote, in life, one can pretend to care, but you cannot pretend to show up. The truth is that the Jewish people are in a war of survival, and when you are at war, you want to know who is really with you, who stands with you, and who does not. A proverb from the Ethiopian Jewish community states, when spiders unite, they can tie down a lion. We need to unite now. We need to be together now. We need to carry the stretcher now. Now. Listen, I know it's Yom Kippur. An Israeli Mazik wrote the following about Yom Kippur. It starts off a little bit amusing, but then you realize where he's going. He says, it's Yom Kippur, and I'm hungry. I'm hungry for peace, hungry for humanity, hungry for tolerance, hungry for moral courage, hungry for compassion, hungry for a time where Jews, hungry for a time where Jews and all peoples can pray and exist without fear. Hungry. In a year which has been filled with so much sorrow and strife, this is the only response we have. And that response is to be together and to love one another. In the coming year, may prejudice and hatred be replaced by acceptance and love. May war and strife be replaced by harmony and peace. L'shana tova. L'shana tova yoter. May 5785 be a better year. Indeed. A better year for our family. A better year for yours. A year which we see the hostages released. A better year for the displaced people in Western Carolina and South Carolina and Florida on the East Coast. A better year for Israel, for Ukraine, for all humankind. Am Yisrael Chai. May the Jewish people live and prevail. Amen.
Amen.